There's a thought in NFL circles that losing, especially constant losing, can become part of a team's culture. Although no team ever wants that, the sad truth is that it does happen, and the misery can seem never-ending. Being the worst team in an NFL season is bad enough, but how about for an entire decade? Today we're going to be going through each decade during the Super Bowl era and identifying that worst team. And we will be using C-score to do so. We took the C-score of every team in every season within a decade, and whoever accumulated the lowest number will receive this ignominious honor. As is always the case, a deeper explanation of C-score and how it works is available in the description below. Thank you for joining us today. Away we go. Because the Super Bowl era begins in 1966, this is going to be a shortened decade, only 4 years to look at. But the worst team during those 4 seasons were the Atlanta Falcons, with their total C-score just missing the negative 100 mark. In their 4 seasons, they had 3 negative scores, they won 12 total games, they got outscored on average by about 12.5 points, never had a winning record, never went to the playoffs, they cycled through 2 head coaches. The second place team during the decade was the Miami Dolphins, their fellow 1966 expansion brethren. The Falcons had a rough beginning to life in the NFL. In fact, those first 3 seasons rank among the absolute worst in the Super Bowl era, as we've covered in a previous video. After 6 wins in their first 3 seasons, they matched those 6 wins in 1969 under new head coach Norm Van Brocklin. More than just the win total though, they turned their point differential from negative 219 in 1968 to positive 8 in 1969. They were more than 16 points better on a per game basis, a simply remarkable turnaround. But those first 3 seasons were a bit too much to overcome. Atlanta got their first winning record just 2 seasons later, during a period of higher competitiveness in the early 1970s. That makes for a silky smooth transition into our next decade, the silky smooth 1970s. And the worst team during this decade was a bit of a no contest. It belongs to the New Orleans Saints. Their combined C-score, negative 187.619. Negative C-scores in every season. They only won 42 games, just missed losing 100 games. Had they played 16-game schedules in the earlier part of the decade, they certainly would have got there. They were outscored on average by an entire touchdown for every game of the decade. They did not get a single winning record. They did manage one 500 record. They cycled through 6 head coaches. The runner-up this decade were the New York Jets. In a manner of speaking, the Saints had a topsy-turvy run during the 1970s, but the swings were between really bad and simply terrible. They finished last in the NFC West 6 times, with 2 second-to-last place finishes. This during an era where only the Rams were consistently good, and second place could be thought to be up for grabs every season. But finish second they did to close out the decade, climbing up to an 8-8 record, their first non-losing record in their 13th season in the league. The bottom fell out the following year though, and it wouldn't be until 1987 that they achieved that winning record. It should be noted that on a per-season basis, the Tampa Bay Buccaneers, having debuted in 1976, were worse in the decade than the Saints were. We now move on to my favorite decade, the 1980s. The 49ers were the best team during this decade. I don't think I gotta tell too many people that. But the worst team were the Tampa Bay Buccaneers. Their C-score for the decade, negative 139.354. They did clear triple digits in losses with 106 against 45 wins and a tie. They were outscored on average by 6 points per game. They did pull off 2 winning records with 2 playoff appearances, but they were unable to get wins there. They cycled through 3 head coaches, edging out the Baltimore/Indianapolis Colts for this honor. After starting 0-26 in their first 2 seasons, the Bucs found themselves in the 1979 NFC Championship game. They were back in the playoffs in 1981 and in the strike-shortened 1982 seasons, going a combined 14-11 before going one and done again in the playoffs. Then the Yuccaneers made their triumphant return, losing double-digit games every season for the rest of the decade, topping out at 6 wins in 1984 and never finishing higher than 3rd in the NFC Central. Then they drafted Bo Jackson 1st overall in 1986, after they intentionally screwed him over by cheating him out of his college baseball eligibility, despite his vow to never play it down for them. He never did, and the Bucks would have been better off trading that pick for a coupon to Bennigan's. The 1990s was the decade that closed out the 20th century. On the football field, there's one team that closed out more than anybody else, the Cincinnati Bengals. Their cumulative C-score, negative 152.507. They went 52-108, unable to win a third of their games. They spent the decade on average being outscored by 6 points per game. They did pull off a bunch of ones here, a winning record, a 500 record, a playoff appearance, and a win. They went through 3 head coaches. They beat out the Phoenix/Arizona Cardinals for this honor. 2 years after almost winning Super Bowl 23, the Bengals were back in the playoffs and notching a massive 27-point victory over their division rivals, the Houston Oilers. The good times did not last, with only 14 wins over the next 4 seasons, only spared a last-place finish in 1994 by those same Oilers. They showed some life with an exciting offense over the next 3 seasons, notching 22 wins, but they were not able to grab a winning season. They ended the decade with an absolute thud, putting together C-scores nearing negative 30 with records of 3-13 and 4-12. They wouldn't secure a winning record until 2005 and wouldn't notch a playoff win until 2021 when they made another run to the Super Bowl, finally putting this dreadful decade behind them. A new century, a new millennium, but before that came a new decade. We enter the 2000s, also known as the aughts, and the worst team in this decade were the Detroit Lions. They went 42-118. They could barely average 4 wins per season. Their C-score, very bad, minus 184.082. They were being outscored by more than a touchdown for every game of the decade. They managed 1 winning record, but could never get to the playoffs, certainly never won a playoff game, and they had 7 different head coaches. For the second straight decade, the Arizona Cardinals were spared the top spot by finishing 2nd worst. Detroit is the only franchise appearing in this video to predate the inaugural season of the AFL in 1960, adding further long-standing misery to the franchise. They made the playoffs 6 times during the 90s, and they opened the aughts at 9-7, but that would prove to be the high point. 2007 would be the only other season in the decade where they escaped a negative double-digit C-score. But then they followed that up with the first ever 0-16 season in NFL history, and the first ever winless campaign in the Super Bowl era from a non-expansion team. All told, they finished last in their division 6 times, and second to last 4 times, very rarely, if ever, showing signs of being competitive. They would only make 4 playoff appearances over the next 15 seasons, but they are legitimate Super Bowl contenders in 2024. We've now come upon our final full decade in this video. This will be the 2010s, and representing the 2010s as its worst NFL franchise are the Jacksonville Jaguars. Their C-score, negative 152.655. They could only manage 51 wins against 109 losses. They were getting outscored on average by 5.5 points. They went through 5 head coaches during the decade. We're going to take a closer look at the rest of these stats here. They beat out the Cleveland Browns to this title. 7 of the 58 seasons displayed in this video contain positive C-scores. Only 5 of those are higher than 1, and only 2 are higher than 5. Only 1 went to double digits, and that belongs to the 2017 Jacksonville Jaguars, an absolute one-year wonder who absolutely would have played in Super Bowl 52 if they didn't shoot themselves in the foot. And with that Saxonville defense, they would have had an excellent chance at winning it. Take that season away and replace it with an average 2010s Jaguar season, and that Z-score plummets to less than negative 188. 7 different seasons of 11 losses or more, 8 different top 10 draft picks produced, and 9 seasons of zero hope added up to 10 years of sadness for the residents of Duval County. And now we arrive at the present and ongoing decade of the 2020s. And in the short few years we've completed, the worst team has been the New York Jets. Their C-score, negative 67.432. They've only won 20 games against 47 losses, good for 5 per season. They are getting outscored on average by more than a touchdown per game. All zeros here except for head coaches, they've gone through 2. They were able to squeeze this out over the second place finishers, the Houston Texans. Maybe it's because they play in the nation's largest television market, but it seems as though every season for the New York Jets begins with a lot of hope. After back-to-back AFC title game appearances all the way back in 2009 and 2010, the Jets have yet to make it back to the playoffs and have only achieved 1 winning record, which wasn't done in this decade. Perhaps there is some hope though. After a 2-14 record to start the decade, the Jets have either increased or matched their win total from one season to the next, and there are expectations that they will be in playoff contention come the 2024 season. Only time will tell. Let's take a look at how these teams rank against each other by their average C-score per season within the decade. We'll be including the 1970s Buccaneers here because they did lead the decade in average lowest C-score, and they just missed the number 1 spot. That belongs to the expansion team that came before them, the Atlanta Falcons. The expansion team that came between them, the New Orleans Saints, have the highest average here of any team that played a full decade, and they were in their 4th season of existence by the time 1970 came along. The best of the worst here are the 1980s Bucks. In a decade that's not immediately known for parity, this is not something I would have guessed. The New York Jets have 6 years to get themselves off this list. My suspicion tells me that they won't. Thank you so much for joining us today and for getting to this point in the video. If you liked it, show the love by hitting that thumbs up button and sharing it around. And if you haven't done so already, please subscribe to the channel and ding that bell for all future notifications. What did you think about all of this? Any surprises? I thought for sure that the Browns would take the 2010s, especially since Jacksonville did have that one very good season. But in the end, the Jags pulled it off, so to speak. Let me know of any thoughts you may have about this or anything else. Thank you once again, and until next time, I hope you have an awesome day.